Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today, I'm joined again by Terminal Philosophy for Part 8 of our History of Warfare series, focusing on the military reforms of Cyrus the Great and the Persian army. So, where we had left off before, the Assyrian Empire had just fallen to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians. And what basically is going on in this immediate aftermath period is the military innovations of the Assyrians are essentially spread to these other kingdoms, and they sort of become the default organizational method. And the Medes, the Babylonians, they follow similar forms. Now Cyrus the Great, in the beginnings of his campaigns, his army is really not an imperial or conscript army at all. It's really just basically his household guard at the beginning when he revolts against the Medians. And eventually it then becomes an imperial levy. And the imperial levy is the Kara. And so that is what initially that would have referred to Cyrus as friends and kinsmen and members of the tribe fit for war. Eventually that then becomes more of a conscript draft system, and the Persians adapt the more professional army system of the Medians. And if we begin with Cyrus, he brought in a bunch of military reforms. So if we look at the infantry formations, there's essentially three main infantry formations: the Takabara infantry, the Sparabara infantry, and the Immortals. The Takabara infantry are more like skirmishers, so like javelineers and archers. They sort of they're very mobile, right? They're going to have silken or cloth armor, which, as we'll see in a much, much later video with the Mongols, is quite effective at negating or blunting penetration of enemy arrows, especially if the fibers are strong enough. They might punch through even the skin tissue, but they won't infect the skin. And if you just pull the cloth out, you'll pull the arrow out. And since missile weapons were the primary weapon of the ancient Near East, it would make sense that that's the kind of armor that would be preferred for these forces. And they're more like skirmishers. The what we might call the mainline infantry of the Sparabara. What Sparabara means shield bearers, so they have these large wicker shields. In many ways, they serve a similar role to the medieval pavis that the crossbowman would hide behind, which we'll get to that in a much later lecture. And the front row would have these large wicker shields, which would be held up, which would, with the ideal being that incoming enemy missile fire would come in and hit those shields. The second, third, and fourth rank behind would be armed with bows, and they would fire over the heads of the shield bearers in order to soften up the enemy forces. The Sparabara were also armed with short 2-meter spears, which they would then use to close with the enemy once they were sufficiently disrupted. And then there's the elite formations called the Immortals. Now, the main debate is, when were the Immortals exactly created? Were they created by Cyrus the Great or later kings? Were they an evolution of the imperial bodyguard that Cyrus had? The general consensus is that they were. And the Immortals were armed and equipped like the Sparabara in many ways, except that they had superior quality and slightly more diverse weapons. So they would have had the same wicker shield, though their armor might have been more like the scale mail that we've heard about with the Assyrians and some of the more noble Scythian forces. But again, this is more of an elite niche weapon. They would have still had the bow for fighting at a distance, but unlike the Sparabara, they had more options for melee combat. So in addition to the 2-meter spear, they also had a battle axe, which of course is much more useful for getting through armored formations, and a short sword. And we don't have exact details of the basic training of these groups. Of course, the Immortals would receive the elite training, of course. And while there is some instance that Cyrus the Great says that he was trained to fight with spear and bow on foot and on horseback, one could assume that such training would be standard for the elite forces of the Persians, at least the immortals, if not some of the other cavalry forces as well. And then you had some of the real innovations of Cyrus. Cyrus added essentially 2 new elements to the mounted warfare, in addition to what we've already covered, the horse archers and the Assyrian cavalry, which are not yet heavily armed cataphracti or knights, but more just mobile lancers or swordsmen. He adds the chariot, the scythe chariot, which is intended, instead of being a mobile missile firing platform, to be a shock system, where you have blades attached to the wheels of the chariot that can then run down enemy forces. And the camel, which is a sort of anti-cavalry technique, where the smell and the sight and the noise of the camels were intended to disrupt enemy formations. And we'll get to this a little bit later in the talk, but at the Battle of Thymbra, Cyrus kind of ties all these innovations together to defeat a superior Lydian force. When it comes to siege warfare, again, Cyrus uses, he prefers storms. So, for example, the siege of Sardis was only 14 days, didn't last very long at all. Babylon capitulates without much of a fight. But again, a lot of the classic techniques of scaling ladders, sapping, siege towers, storm through earthen ramparts that the Assyrians perfected, the Persians continue to this tradition. They continue this tradition of military professionalism with the siege corps, which was of great value to Cyrus in his conquests. And so that's sort of a summary of the military reforms of Cyrus. So what are some of the thoughts that you have here at Terminal Philosophy?
Right. Well, as we discussed with the Neo-Assyrians, with this ability to raise a dynamic army, meaning they are dividing their troops into multiple categories and specializations, really so too did the armies of Cyrus, but generally on a greater level. Once again, the historical accuracy and clarity is kind of a mixed bag from clay tablets from the Persians and the Neo-Babylonians. Approximately 30,000 tablets were discovered at the Achaemenid capital of Persepolis. Many of the tablets found there sort of reference battles and many of the logistical happenings between Persian cities. There's also the Babylonian clay tablet known as the Nabonidus Chronicle, which is most popular among historians as it's really considered contemporaneous for the time. It covers the last years of the reign of the Babylonian king Nabonidus, and then Cyrus's campaign into Mesopotamia and his eventual conquering of the Babylonians, at which during all this the Battle of Opis occurs. And then, of course, there are the later accounts from Xenophon and Herodotus, much of which includes, mythical accounts of various events mixed with real historical events and figures. So again, between these 4 sources of Babylonian and Persian tablets and Xenophon and Herodotus, we're still sort of at the mercy of archaeology for creating the best picture of the past. Perhaps on a future stream we can discuss the problems with archaeology, but that's really kind of where we're at as far as deriving information from these sort of compounding sources. In the analysis of Cyrus's armies, we really have about 8 major categories of fighting men to refer to. As you mentioned before, there's the Spara Bara, which are the majority of the Persian forces, which are basically spearmen with large rectangular shields that have been found in multiple archaeological sites. There's the Takabara, which are the lighter infantry and more mobile, kind of like a support infantry with shorter swords and half-moon wicker shields and axes. There's, of course, the famous Persian archers, who, as you mentioned before, would set up their formations behind the spearmen the Sparabara and Takabara. And then you have the median derived elite Amataka, or the Immortals, which according to Xenophon were sort of kept at around 10,000. And then there's the cavalry, which was believed to have been made up of Persian nobility, but as you said before, there's not really any armor used with the Persian cavalry. They were kept as sort of like a light force with spears and javelins. And then from there, you also have the scythe chariot, which had bronze blades sticking out about approximately 3 feet from both of the wheels from the axle. And again, these were really used as, there's some speculation as whether these were used to punch holes through infantry because there's more weight. With the scythe chariot, it was believed to have like 4 horses with about 3 crewmen, sort of a charioteer, and then 2 other soldiers. And then you have the camels, which we'll get into here in a minute with the Battle of Thymbra, which throws off the smells of horses, and they're kind of sort of this confusing and sort of terrifying sight for horses. And then you have his battle towers, sort of these mobile strong points for archers and for sort of battlefield observation. So again, you have this tradition of division of troops where specialization becomes more acute, and you have really isolated roles with a lot of different military units. Really, there's about 5 battles that are the best recorded, but of those 5, the Battle of Thymbra is really kind of the centerpiece of historical analysis for Cyrus's armies, because again, you have references from Xenophon and Herodotus, and you also have, of course, you have the Cyrus cylinder. And then there are clay tablets that refer to the battle as well. This is generally believed where Cyrus was outnumbered about 2-1 from the Lydians. And really the setup for the battle is that before Thymbra occurred, there was the Battle of Pteria, which is in more central Anatolia, where the Lydians had been pushed back from Cyrus as he pushed west closer to the Aegean Sea. And really, this was getting towards the autumn, where rivers were easier to cross for Cyrus's forces, and it was sort of in sort of a quasi-military tradition. As it got closer to winter, armies would sort of mutually decide to sort of end the conflict and retract back to their city-states. But Cyrus kind of went against the rules and pursued Croesus, the king of the king of the Lydians, and defeated him in the Battle of Thymbra, which again, a lot of the sources do conflict with each other a bit, but there's this sort of general image that Cyrus had defeated Croesus by first drawing in his cavalry to be entangled with his infantry and the camels that he brought with him, which appears to have been sort of a last minute acquisition from Cyrus, but that sort of sent the Lydian cavalry in sort of this disentangled mess. And as Cyrus's cavalry was watching this happen, he basically sent them in from the far right and far left flanks to sort of clean up the disentangled army, which after Praeteria, they were sort of in this shaken state. So really, after the battle, like thousands and thousands were killed, and this led to the siege of Sardis, which was a 2-week-long siege. And from there, Sardis was the capital of Lydia. And after the siege of Sardis, this is when Lydia was absorbed into Cyrus's empire.
Yeah. So if we start with Cyrus's military career, it begins with the war against the Medes with King Astyages. And even if we don't necessarily accept the reasons why Harpagus, his second in command, revolts, according to Herodotus, is because Astyages made Harpagus eat his own son. That may or may not have happened. That's rather colorful. But what is also confirmed in the Nabonidus Chronicle is that Cyrus, his victory over the Median king, was in part because of the mutiny, where Astyages basically just lost control of his army at the Battle of Passagardi. It ultimately wasn't much of a battle because the vast majority of the king's forces defected. And this then ceded this vast empire to Cyrus and got him into conflict with Croesus. And because Croesus was then in an alliance with Astyages, and he's like, uh-oh, Cyrus is starting to take over everything and getting us in trouble. And, if we look at one of the early battles in the Lydian campaign is the Battle of Pateria, which is somewhat inconclusive. I mean, Cyrus has to cross the Halys River into Lydia, and I think this is where you commented earlier that he didn't play like a nice boy and camp during the winter. He kept on pursuing the Lydians, which forced him the battle at Thimbra. And then Thimbra really is the battle which has the most detailed accounts. And as far as it seems to me with the accounts at Thimbra, is that Cyrus had his center, sort of this outward facing crescent, anchored in the middle by 6 siege towers, but used not in a siege, but as a tactical formation on the battlefield to have to be able to shoot from a higher position into the ranks of the Lydian forces. And the Lydians were renowned for their cavalry, and Cyrus wanted to negate them with his camels. And he thought that the sight, sound, and smell of them would disrupt the enemy cavalry, which they effectively did. And as the Lydian forces are assaulting essentially the Sparabara, presumably also the Immortals, the other thing is that Persian commanders would often fight in the midst of the battle. For example, Mardonius does at Plataea, which we'll get to with the Greek wars. And if the Immortals were in existence at this time, it's quite likely that they would have been in the front line, in the thick of it, with the Persian commanders, holding the line against the Lydian forces. And as they then move in, they envelop the Lydian forces as those horses are scattered by the sight and smell of the camels. And the only force, according to Xenophon, that performs well on the Lydian side is the Egyptian mercenaries. But by the time that they're the last force to be dealt with by Cyrus, they've already suffered severe attrition, and Cyrus releases the scythe chariots, which according to Xenophon does fearful damage to the Egyptians and finally brings them to heel. And his preferred method of siege is again storm. The siege of Sardis only lasts 14 days. He doesn't really dilly-dally when it comes to taking this out. So you could argue Cyrus sort of breaks the conventions of the day. He doesn't wait during winter. He attacks rapidly in like a blitzkrieg style, and through his superior engineering corps is able to rapidly take strong points, not allowing the Lydians time to prepare a defense in depth or a long resistance. And this is really a campaign that highlights all of strategic, tactical brilliance of Cyrus in a way that the other campaigns, due to their relatively short duration, due to things like defection, as in the case of the Medians, well, even in the case of the Babylonians, doesn't really give us a chance to see what is on offer for Cyrus. Though it is interesting, though, that when we get to the later period of the Greek wars, the Persians are no longer using battle towers, camels, or scythe chariots. And one might wonder why is it that they were only used in the Lydian campaign and not after. But that's really more speculative. So what are some of your thoughts on this part of Cyrus's campaigns?
Right. Well, first, I kind of apologize for jumping the gun straight to Thimbra. I think the reason why I did that is what we discussed earlier, is that as far as sources go, it's sort of the best picture that we have of his campaign. But before that, you also have, I mean, yeah, I think we both agree that Thimbra and this campaign into Lydia is sort of, Lydians probably were his most formidable enemy. If we really think about uh, the four enemies of the Persians during Cyrus, well, you have the Medes, the Lydians, Babylon, and the Scythians. And really, the Lydians did develop this reputation for having great cavalry. And the Lydians were also very wealthy for their time, with a lot of wealth centralized in Sardis. So they had a lot of resources, and they recruited a lot of mercenaries. Notable of which was the Egyptians, which after the Battle of Thimbra, it was according to Xenophon that the Egyptian mercenaries actually defected to Cyrus's army. So again, I think this is kind of evidence of kind of a shocked and defeated routing army, and that mercenary forces, especially during this sort of ancient and then later on in medieval times, a lot of mercenary forces would end up defecting because, well, a lot of them are just there for the money, and they have sort of sometimes multi-ethnic compositions and varying identities and motivations. So that's kind of interesting to hear that from Xenophon about the Egyptians. However, before that, you have, I apologize. I think after that, you have the Battle of Opis with the Babylonians, and really, this was something that survived on the Nabonidus's chronicle, which is the single clay tablet. This really describes just similar with fighting the Medians at the Battle of Hirba. It's kind of a one and done battle, whereas the Babylonians muster up a large centralized force, but Cyrus still defeats them, and then they sort of just enter the gates of Babylon uncontested, because there was really no defense that they could marshal against Cyrus by the time the Battle of Opis was concluded. Uh, as you mentioned too, with the battle towers in Thimbra, they're really this sort of centerpiece where you can, well, really sort of like a mobile strong point for archers and for sort of ancient battlefield observers. That was really kind of an interesting thing. So again, you have this really robust sort of combined arms force going on, where you have highly trained infantry, very disciplined, very, at least amongst the Sparabara and the Immortals, and from Media especially, you have more of this homogeneous force, and highly disciplined and highly motivated. And then again, what would appear to be this sort of last minute scramble and use of camels to throw off the smell and to be this sort of terrifying sight for horses. He had a lot of things going for him in terms of having a really dynamic force. And with the scythe chariot as well, I think this is sort of, with the 6th century BC, 5th century BC, this is sort of you could say, as far as the Eastern Mediterranean goes, this is sort of the final eras for the scythe chariot, at least as it was used by Persia. Yeah, I think I think before we sort of move on to some other campaigns and politics, I think that's a fair assessment for Cyrus.
Yeah, and what really needs to be stressed again is that this sort of military tradition that you could argue beginning with Sargon of Akkad, continuing up through the Middle Babylonian Empire with Hammurabi, up through the Neo-Assyrian Empire with Ashurnasirpal, finally culminating in Cyrus the Great. This whole, what we might call Mesopotamian way of war, is finally reached its fruition under the Persians. And again, this is in large part why I'm highly skeptical of any argument that in the Bronze Age they were what we would call phalanx formations, like anything we'd see with the Greeks. Because it seems to me inconceivable that an innovator like Cyrus the Great would not have used phalanxes if that had been the norm in Bronze Age and early Iron Age Mesopotamia. And then, by the time Darius and Xerxes invade the Greeks, they're totally outmatched. To me, that just seems extremely unlikely. And if we look at the Sparabara and the Immortals, I think that we could argue that model, that style, goes all the way back to Sargon of Akkad. And that's what we see on the Vulture Stela, something like them. But this is the final terminus of that development. Babylon, again, like the Medians, was a shaky kingdom that didn't really have any sort of wherewithal to fight. Opus isn't very well discussed. By this point, Cyrus is beginning to develop a large multinational army with Lydian mercenaries, Egyptian mercenaries, as well as the Medes and the Persians. And what's interesting is that the Persian army initially at its origin is relatively homogeneous. The Medes and the Persians themselves aren't really that different culturally or ethnically. And so that's sort of the core of his fighting force. And so while he's technically outnumbered by the Lydians are a little more polyglot. There's Egyptians, some sources say possibly even Greek mercenaries. And then, of course, by the time he gets to Babylon, he's got the large polyglot army. And his final campaign, which is unsuccessful, is against the Scythians. He tries to subjugate the Massageti, the Scythian tribe. And basically what ends up happening as he starts crossing the rivers, the Oxus and the Amu Darya, he becomes more and more in a precarious situation, right? Because the Scythians are going to pursue the same technique they will against Darius, this withdrawing technique. And once, he's getting near the end of his supply lines and he needs a decisive victory, Tamaris, queen of the Scythians, is like, okay, what are you going to do? You going to leave, or are we going to have to drive you out by force? And of course, up to this point, Cyrus has been largely invincible. And, he thinks he can handle this. And while, again, sadly, there isn't the kind of details that we would like, the superiority and horsemanship of the Scythians, possibly some speculation being that they even had armored cavalry. This might be, the proto-lancers that would later be used by the Sarmatians, decimated the Persians, and Cyrus the Great himself was killed. I think one of the reasons why Cyrus falters in the Scythian War is for a reason the Persians will later falter against the Greeks. One of the things is that one aspect of the Persian army that is very seldom mentioned in contemporary accounts is that by the end of the reign of Cyrus and throughout, it's a ethnically diverse army, different religions, different languages, different cultures, all serving the great king. And you can imagine the command and control nightmare that is going to entail. You have, 24 different languages. I mean, it's really difficult to envision how effective command and control can be held here. We'll also see that Egypt is a chronic issue for the Persians in later lectures, very difficult for them to hold. And I think if you look at, say, the Scythians, much like the Greeks, are fiercely independent people that are relatively homogeneous in religion and culture and in language. They might not be politically united in a sort of imperial sense as Persia was, but they have other more fundamental unity. And so you could say that because the Scythians, and it appears by most of the accounts that Tamaris was a strong political leader, like, say, a Queen Elizabeth of England or a Queen Victoria of England, such that she could unite her peoples beyond their normal squabblings. And so the Scythians, like the Greeks, have this command and control advantage because they don't have all these different languages, these different religions, and these people kind of know each other. They can kind of trust each other. And then I think one reason why Cyrus is defeated in part is probably he thinks he's invincible, but also I think you begin to see a weakening in the command and control structure of the Persian forces. And so this sort of caps the career of Cyrus. What are some of your thoughts on that terminal philosophy?
Right. Well, you and I are definitely in total agreement there. I mean, the downfall of Cyrus is sort of it's sort of the classic downfall of any empire from antiquity, where you've overextended beyond your ability to really rule, despite a lot of his sort of political, administrative, and sort of pacification techniques that he ended up implementing on the territory. There really just wasn't anything. There was no truly robust logistical system to maintain things after his death. Um, and you're right, with the Scythian campaign, where they were ultimately unsuccessful to really take that territory of the I can't remember. It starts with an M. The territory of you mentioned earlier. I'll find it later, but where he ended up being killed by the Scythian queen Tamaris. I mean, you really have something like overextended supply lines. It would have been materially intensive to build multiple bridges on the Onyx River, and then of course you're fighting this really unconventional war where there's this sort of like ambush tactics and like fight and flee type of a thing on horseback. A lot of the Scythian armor that's found in archaeological sites, there's a lot of speculation if that's truly Scythian in origin or if it was, gained through plunder, which is more or less what is agreed upon in with amongst historians and archaeologists. So, the further that you chase this force northward and in just further away from these city states, well, you've just got this, you've got sort of a supply problem, and you end up having a morale problem where there was some speculation by Herodotus before Cyrus's death that, similar to Alexander's men, how they had campaigned so long and so far away from home, that there's some speculation that there was nothing for them in Scythia, and so there was sort of uh, this loss of this diminishing morale of wanting to be there. Again, this is speculative on the part of both the ancient sources as well as modern day archaeology, but I think there's probably some truth to that, because by the time they are fighting the Scythians, they had already defeated the Medes, the Lydians, and the Babylonians, and then yet again he's kind of biting at the bit to conquer even more. Well, yeah, I think that proved to be fatal for him. Now, what's interesting is that there's sort of this kind of a source of contention whether or not Cyrus actually himself conquered into Egypt, or that was his son shortly after his death. I think it's more believed that his son was the one who ended up taking the territory of Egypt's historical lands. So yeah, I think really he is believed more or less to have died from. It's Herodotus who reported his death in Scythia, and yeah, I don't think, again, when you have these traditional conventional armies in heavy formations trying to chase down these sort of harassing cavalry forces, well, that sort of changes the sort of nature of the battle in general. And I don't know that. I mean, as much of an innovator as he was, both as like a military thinker and as a administrator, I don't think he had really a good answer for the Scythians, and really no one would until Alexander came along.
Yes. The next major expansion of the Persian Empire would be Egypt, which it seems Cyrus would have gone to Egypt if he didn't already, had he not been killed by the Scythians. And that was left up to his son, Cambyses II, who did not rule very long. It's the Battle of Pelusium in 525. And again, we don't have a lot of accounts of the battle, but one of the most intriguing elements of how this battle unfolded is from the Macedonian general Polyaenus, who writes that this is a second century AD source, and he argues that while the Egyptians early on gave the Persians, as good as they got, Cambyses decided to flip the script, if you will, and take advantage of the Egyptian religion. He apparently painted images of cats on his shoulder shields and marched in front of his troops animals sacred to the Egyptians like cats and ibises. And what's interesting too is that Egypt really didn't like the Persians, and as we'll see when we talk about the Greeks, are constantly revolting and asking the Greeks for help. Now, if Cambyses showed such disrespect and blasphemy to the Egyptian gods in order to beat them in battle using literally the most dirty trick in the book, that would actually explain why the Egyptians didn't like the Persians that much. It would be like the Greeks going into the temple and sacrificing a pig. It's that level of transgressive. It's of course tactically very effective, almost like the latter day when the Mongols would march captured soldiers in front of their troops as a human shield. And we do say that the Persians are very, in their early period, are very innovative, very creative. They'll use, all sorts of, what they call today thinking outside of the box. And it's quite plausible, I think, that Cambyses, would have seen his father Cyrus using all these creative strategies, would have done that as well to the Egyptians. And he then, again, following his father's sort of lightning strike techniques, he then sieges Memphis and destroys the Egyptian power base in another lightning campaign. And really, with a few additions here and there later on, the conquests of Cyrus and Cambyses will be the limits of Persian imperial growth, really until the end of the empire.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right about the Egyptian power base being destroyed in sort of this Blitzkrieg-esque lightning campaign. Along with that, you've got sort of Cyrus's administrative capabilities being shown before his death in I was trying to find the word, but I think it's called Parsegade, where he would build sort of basically governor palaces of in a lot of these different city states that he ended up conquering. So he sort of left regional management to a lot of different kings after these places were conquered. That way, he wasn't overwhelmed with too much management for one person. Um, and this is kind of where he gains the historical title of King of Kings. Sometimes he's referred to as that, or something like that, sort of grandiose. But he, again, he should be well known as both like a military innovator and then a fairly gifted administrator, because up until that time, this transition of late Bronze Age, early Iron Age in Eastern Mesopotamia, I mean, this region had gone through people like the Neo-Assyrians, who had this sick affinity for mass decapitations of surrendering armies or antagonistic people, or the Aramaean tribes, were under this horrible oppressive hammer from the Neo-Assyrians. So it was, even for his time, which I don't know, I necessarily agree with the left-leaning conventional image of Cyrus being this pacifist, Mahatma Gandhi of the ancient world. I mean, he was still a conqueror, and he was still, he was still a general. But I think after these battles, many of them, he did develop a reputation for that time that was unique in that time for being a bit more hospitable and understanding to the following occupations, because I think rather than follow the sort of old Bronze Age, early Iron Age formula of conquering a city, reducing it to rubble, and then rebuilding it, well, I think he at least had the foresight and to see that a lot of this infrastructure and agriculture was already in place at a lot of these city states. All we need is kind of a change of management, and just a different paint job, if so to speak. So, and then you'll see similar aspects under Alexander, and about 200 or 300 years later after Cyrus. But again, I think you'll see this sort of overextension, and as we had talked about before, you had an army and a general empire of peoples who, again, as far as we know, could have been dealing with 6 to 10 different languages, well, the king of Media might have a lot of different ideas about how things are going to be done versus, the king in Memphis or in Eastern or Western Anatolia. So again, it's sort of the classic story of like after this great emperor conquers a ton of territory and does some initially great administrative things. Well, after his death, his son has sort of like a short moment in the sun with conquering Egypt, but then everything really collapses, and you'll see this pattern again with Alexander and his campaign, as we'll certainly discuss later on.
Yeah. Now, if we look at the Persian, what was there, Cyrus the Great, or Persian pacification methods, Cyrus pursued two kinds of methods. One is, again, this more conciliatory method, which we see from two sources primarily. We see in the Nabonidus Chronicle, where he respects the god Marduk, which many Babylonians were upset that Nabonidus had instead decided to give honor to the moon god Sin. And so they're like, yeah, this guy's an apostate. Cyrus is definitely our boy. And so they sort of definitely were more loyal to Cyrus because he respected the god Marduk. And then the Old Testament, so in the book of 2 Chronicles, Cyrus is praised for letting the Israelites return from their captivity and beginning the process that subsequent Persian kings would continue of empowering the Israelites to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so we see this tolerant practice continue throughout the kings of Persia, specifically with regard to Israel. But there's also a more maybe darker side to Cyrus's pacification techniques, where he was more than willing to play hardball with people that rose up. So there's an example in Herodotus of the siege of Sardis. Sardis revolts after he conquers the city, and at this point, Croesus is an advisor to the king, and he wants to sell them all into slavery. He's just like, I'm fed up with the Lydians. I don't want to deal with them anymore. And Croesus is like, well, we don't. Herodotus explains Croesus's decision here is like, well, I don't want my people to be sold into slavery. So, how is it that he convinces Cyrus to do this? And he says, "O king, that which thou hast said is not without reason, but not thou altogether give vent to thy wrath, nor destroy an ancient city, which is guiltless both of the former things and of those which have come to pass now." And then skipping down, he says, "But the Lydians, I pray thee, pardon and lay upon their commanders as follows, in order that they may not revolt nor be a cause of any danger to thee. Send to them and forbid them to possess weapons of war, but bid them, on the other hand, put on tunics under the outer garments and be shod with buskins, and proclaim to them that they train their sons to play the lyre and the harp and retail dealers. And thou shalt see, O king, that they have become women instead of men, so that they will be no fear that they will revolt against thee." And so basically it's, turning the Lydians into women, these effeminate people that can be easily pacified. And we also see with Cambyses, his son, a more ruthless form of pacification where you use complete disregard of the enemy's religion to take advantage of his holy days and festivals and sacred objects to completely, destroy them. We read about the use of the cats and sacred images, like the ibis and animals at Pelusium, but Herodotus records he also destroyed the Apis bull. And so there's that sort of brutal crackdown. And also with the Ionian revolt, we also see the Persians are more than willing to punish these cities for revolt more seriously. Now, maybe one could argue the distinction between, say, Cyrus's intended punishment for Lydia or Sardis and the later punishments for the Ionians is that these are rebellions, right? The Persians are going to offer you generous terms if you're fighting them in a battle to sort of, ease the surrender process. But, don't take advantage of their goodwill, because if you revolt again, they're gonna make sure that doesn't happen again. And again, Cambyses does seem to be unusual in that his overt overture of conquest was really heavy-handed. and cruel compared to the Achaemenid norms. And even as we'll see later with Darius, his terms for the Greeks in Asia Minor, for those that submitted, were not very bad, though he would burn Athens to the ground because he identified Athens as the agent provocateur of the Ionian revolt, or rather Xerxes would. We do see that, again, they could be heavy-handed and ruthless when necessary, but it seems to be that ruthlessness was often associated with rebellion rather than conquest. With conquest, with the exception of Cambyses, they seem to be more clement, and it's like, well, you've abused our goodwill once already, the gloves are coming off, we'll burn your city to the ground. And that seems to be the Persian method, and would explain why they built an empire that stretched from Macedonia to the Indus, within a couple of generations.
Right. Well, you're exactly right. I mean, they with Cambyses, it was interesting to see this sort of like overt turn back to just this sort of brutal subjugation of different peoples, whereas Cyrus was much more I mean, like, again, still for his time, even being a conqueror, still more diplomatic in his occupational approach. I would say too that I mean, I agree with this general image where he wasn't this this sort of pacifist type of a guy, but he should be remembered, if anything, at least as a sort of a more open-minded, more dynamic ruler than many before him, because at least he was willing to bring all these various peoples under his empire without sort of brutal subjugation, similar to the Neo-Assyrians. He is referenced, as you said, in Second Chronicles, but I think also in the book of Ezra, he is sort of generally kind of referred to as this sort of messiah figure for allowing the Israelites to practice their religion and return to modern day Israel. I think with Cyrus in general, I think you have both a military innovator, you have a political thinker, but then you also have sort of this classical version of a leader who he's kind of enamored with his own image at this point for taking all this territory. And this is I believe what really led to his downfall in Scythia, with this he thinks he has this momentum that he can't be stopped, and really he ran into an enemy that wasn't necessarily stronger, but that threw something at him that he couldn't necessarily deal with. Cyrus will definitely be remembered. He's sometimes referred to as the first Persian, and it's an interesting story of when Alexander comes upon his tomb. Well, Alexander's furious because the tomb has been raided, and I think there was like some sort of golden cap to his tomb that had been, of course, stolen. And I think there was this rebuilding effort by Alexander for his tomb, or at least some renovations done to it. So that's sort of interesting. That it's interesting to note that he has sort of this special reputation by the time Alexander comes about, which was, I believe, about 200 years later. Of course, again, we will have probably one or two or maybe even three videos on Alexander, but it is interesting to note that Alexander knew of this big reputation, and that Persia was this Near Eastern empire, and sort of at that time could have been considered a global power.
Yes, I think the other things to add to this discussion about Cyrus and the Persian military method, it seems that the limits on Persian military expansion were also, in some sense, limits of social structure. So to the far east, you had the Scythians, and to the north, you had the Scythians. And to the west, you had the Greeks, and to the south, you had the Bedouin tribes. And all of these are fiercely independent peoples that will not submit to an imperial rule. And it seems that the method of the Akkadian, Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian style of warfare that's sort of predicated upon not only an authoritarian structure, but then subsuming the defeated armies and then incorporating them into your own, because they're all organized along fundamentally the same lines, doesn't work. Because the Scythians and the Arabs and the Greeks are, again, fiercely independent, and they have very different combat structures, as we've already mentioned with the Scythians, and we'll mention with the Greeks in a future lecture. They don't make an easy fit into the mold. Now, eventually the Persians will try to do that when they face off against Alexander the Great, but ultimately that probably makes their troops more unwieldy and more difficult to command. And I think in many ways, the military prowess of the Persians of subsuming conquered peoples is sort of put on the brakes when they fight these fiercely independent peoples that their tactics and strategy aren't really a good fit for fighting. And also, many of the innovations of Cyrus don't seem to be as common in later centuries. So using siege towers in a tactical formation in the open field of battle rather than in the siege doesn't seem to appear really much after Cyrus. The use of camels is rather muted, and scythe chariots. I mean, the next real major representation of scythe chariots is well over 200 years after Thimbra at the Battle of Arbela in the 330 BC. So it seems probably one of the best arguments against some of these military innovations, depending on how much you want to trust Xenophon over Herodotus, is that they're not really used much afterwards. Now, that could just be the case that we have a poverty of Persian records. And if we had those Persian records, we'd see that they really were being used all this time. And the Greeks didn't report on it because they weren't really fighting the Persians in that capacity. Though it does seem strange that there weren't camels, south chariots, or siege towers used in the Greek wars. And one might wonder why that's the case. Who knows? Maybe they just didn't need them at the time, and they eventually rolled them back out as a last-ditch effort to defeat Alexander, possibly. But the Persian forces were well equipped to dealing with other militaries organized along the classic Mesopotamian model. They were much less successful dealing with fiercely independent tribal confederations of like the Scythians or the Greek polis. And we'll get into more of that in a future lecture. So we're nearing the end of the lecture. What would you want to end with, terminal philosophy?
Well, I completely agree with you in the sense that a lot of the tactics that he had used were sort of they weren't really repeated that much. I did read into a bit in the use of camels in warfare throughout the ancient and medieval eras, and really, it is fairly sparse. There's some Arab kings who used camels as sort of a quasi-cavalry unit, and then Muhammad used them a bit later on in his conquests in northern Africa. But really, it was really more of just cavalry and improved stirrups and saddles that were around by that time. So yeah, I agree. I think it's both interesting to note that he had this highly multi-ethnic military and army that I think ultimately ended up creating the sort of the seeds of downfall for his son, and basically the subsequent collapse that came with that. It was just sort of the classical motif of an army or an empire that overextends itself. It doesn't quite know what to do with all of its assets, and in sort of that managerial challenge, you have basically an inevitable downfall. Right. I think we've basically covered everything we can for Cyrus's military. But yeah, thanks again for having me.
Yes, and thank you, Terminal Philosophy. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.